Thank you all for coming out. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my favorite subject, and particularly this time of year when the wheat is ripening and being harvested. Obviously, the Amber Waves comes from America the Beautiful, written back in the 1890s, I believe, but the lady that wrote it was traveling across Kansas to Colorado and saw the wheat and ready for harvesting as she did from the train. So it's kind of appropriate for the time of the year and also to the subject. As he said, I'm an adjunct curator of paleontology at the Sternberg Museum at Hayes. If you haven't been there, I would certainly recommend a trip. It's only a couple hours away from here. And we have some of the best natural history exhibits here in the state, including our fossils, but also lots of animals and so on that we've had in the museum collection for years. 85 million years ago, this was Kansas. There was no land. It was a blue ocean for as far as you could see it, actually from the Gulf of Mexico, all the way up into Kansas, Canada, all the way from Missouri to Arizona, Utah area at one time. A huge ocean, probably as big as the Mediterranean today, only it was oriented north-south in place of east-west. And it was a pretty exciting place. We had all kinds of interesting extinct animals in this ocean. Most of them had large teeth. It would not have been a safe place to swim, or do anything else for that matter. 85 million years ago, the Earth was a much different place. There were no ice caps, there were no glaciers, there were no really winter. And the sea levels were much higher than today. In fact, 85% of the Earth's surface was covered with water. A lot of it was shallow interior seas, epicontinental seas, like through the middle of North America, most of Africa, or Europe was a series of islands. So, there was not a lot of land, and all the dinosaurs that everybody gets excited about were all crowded together on these little spots of land. The ocean was ruled by the sea monsters at this time. In North America, this map kind of shows you where Kansas was, right in the middle of things. The place where I hang out is out in the western part of the state where we have what's called the Smoky Hill Chalk. It was a blue water ocean deposit, really clear water, quite a ways from shore. So it was basically a pure chalk, pretty much like the White Cliffs of Dover and other places around the world that were being deposited about the same time. Some of the badlands that we have out along the Smoky Hill River, basically Ellis County, Gove County, Trego County, Logan County to the west, along the Smoky Hill drainage. This chalk is biogenic. It's not like limestone. Limestone is actually a chemical precipitant that comes out of the water when the concentrations of carbonates and calcium reach a certain point. But in this case, we had billions and billions of tiny microscopic single-celled algae that had a carbonate shell around them. And when they died, the shell would sink to the bottom. And over a space of about 5 million years, we ended up with 600 foot of fairly pure chalk, top to bottom. Since that time, since the ocean went away about 65 million years ago, the chalk has continued to erode, and it produces fantastic badlands features like this, but it also exposes the bones and shells of creatures that lived in that ocean, and that's what keeps me interested out there. Kansas covered by an ocean, really hard to believe, especially at 100 degrees and high winds and dry conditions. Mm-hmm. But we need to remember that just about all of the minerals that we mine here in Kansas, that we actually use or produce here in Kansas, came from the bottom of oceans that covered this state for almost 500 million years that we know about. We're talking about oil and gas that are built up in sea bottoms, salt, gypsum, clay, shale, limestone, chalk. All of these things are money makers if you're in the mining business, but they're all produced in an ocean or in the sediments that accumulate on the sea floor. There's about said Sedgwick County here, but Harvey County is the same. There's about a mile of rocks, ocean bottom, under where we're standing here now. And in that mile of rocks, there's oil and gas and the other mineral products going various places. There are gypsum mines down by Medicine Lodge, of course, the salt that's mined up around Hutchinson, oil and gas from all over the state. Clay is mined for bricks in lots of places in the state. Bricks have been produced here for over 100 years. Our first real paleontologist was a professor at the University of Kansas. Actually, it was called the Kansas State Agricultural College about that time. But he was an Easterner that came to Kansas with about 1859 or 60, I believe, and was interested in fossils and rocks and so on. And so much so, at least in terms of the legislature, they named him the first state geologist in 1865. But similar to what we see in legislatures today, they didn't give any money to do anything. He still explored, documented mineral resources in the eastern half of the state. And then when that was over, he went back to teaching. During the summers, he started going farther and farther west in Kansas and exploring and collecting fossils primarily. Now, note that, well, I can get in that in a second here. Kansas at that time was not settled. We were settled about this far to the west. I don't even think Wichita was much of a place then, although somebody said the 150th anniversary. But the settlement was actually going on from Kansas City on to Denver along the Union Pacific Railway. And as that road was being built, towns were settled, counties were made legal entities, and all the way to the Colorado border. This was during the Indian Wars, and we also had a large presence of the Army here originally at Fort Riley, but then also at Fort Hays and Wallace, further west in Kansas, almost all the way to the Colorado border. The point there is that some of the most educated people, men in the state, were the military doctors that were stationed at these forts. They were trained much more broadly, I suppose, than doctors today. They didn't specialize. You were a surgeon, but you knew about all kinds of aspects of medicine, but you also knew about natural history. And a lot of these guys were collecting fossils back in the 1860s and sending them back east to be identified. As the railroad was built, from basically Kansas City, Topeka area through Ellsworth County, Ellis County, and on out through Wallace and on over here to Denver. The only actual transportation that was going on at the time was the Butterfield Overland Dispatch. It was a stagecoach that ran the route between probably Salina and Denver continuously, but it was a 2 or 3 day trip, and they had to stop every 15 or 20 miles to change horses, and then you stopped overnight someplace and so on. It's a very inefficient way to travel, but as soon as the railroad was completed, it went completely out of business. It was much easier to travel the rails. At Fort Harker, one of the early surgeons there was Dr. George Sternberg. He was the oldest son in the prominent Sternberg family. He was stationed there in the late 1860s and began collecting fossils from the rocks around Ellsworth County, predominantly fossil leaves first, And then with some of the campaigns, he was going further west into western Kansas. Interesting thing about him, as he collected fossils, and I've seen the collection in the Smithsonian, he would sign his name to them. He always wanted people to know who found this thing. So, and then one of his more interesting fossils, I suppose, from my standpoint, is this is a fin ray, a pectoral fin of a fish, a giant fish. And that's all he found, but when he sent it back east, Dr. Leidy at the Academy of Natural Sciences looked at it and said, wow, that's a big catfish. And we're going to call it, oops, back up. Press the wrong button. We're going to call it Zaphactinus, which means sword-like or bold sword or things like that. But if you've seen a catfish, you know, they've got the pectoral fin spines, and that's what he assumed this thing was. And he named a whole genus and species of fish from one bone. You can't do that anymore, but back in the 1870s, that was quite the way things were done. He got away with it. Although it leads us to a little bigger problem later on. That fin ray is actually this fin ray. If you've been out to the Sternberg Museum, you might recognize this as the famous fish in the fish. Well, he named it, it was named from this fin. So one of our interesting paleontology stories. The next one is a giant marine reptile, the giant Elasmosaurus or Plesiosaurs that was found out in Wallace County by a young doctor by the name of Theophilus Turner. The fort was pretty crude at the time. This is headquarters. This is Dr. Turner standing out here, and these are officers from the 7th Cavalry. 1860, that picture was 1866, I believe, 1867. Well, Fort Wallace, as you might imagine, in the wilds of western Kansas, was at that time about 100 miles from the nearest railway, end of the railway. They got their supplies by military wagon train. They got mail about once a week on some sort of a packet. There was nothing really going on in 1867 that was terribly important at the fort. So Dr. Turner was a young guy. He liked to hunt. He was interested in natural history. He'd go out and collect, in that case, in the Sharon Springs member of the shale out there. There are lots of crystals and some fossils, and he would go out and collect these things. And one day he came across a string of bones, string of vertebra like this, but it was 40 feet long. Stretched clear over into there. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it was important. He called it his dragon because it was long, just a long, very long string of vertebra. He sent a couple of the vertebrae back east to Edward Cope in Philadelphia. Cope recognized them from an animal called a plesiosaur. Cope had been in Europe during the Civil War and had visited the museums. And of course, some of these animals were fairly common in their museums already, but not in the United States. But anyway, he sent it back east. Cope, he went out and dug it up and sent the fossil back east, which was quite an undertaking then because they had to load it into a military buckboard wagon, take it across the plains about 70 miles to the railhead in Ellis County, load it up, and then ship it 1,500 miles to Philadelphia. But it arrived in good enough shape that Cope was able to kind of hurriedly put it together, figure out what it was, and call it Elasmosaurus Kansas, flat something ribbon reptile, flat plate ribbon reptile. Problem was, he put the head on the wrong end. And there's a perfectly good explanation for this because Cope was an expert in lizards and salamanders and things like that, which have a short neck and a long tail. He assumed wrongly that this new monster, sea monster, was built the same way. So he hurriedly published this document with the naming and everything. And it took about 6 to 8 months before his boss, Dr. Leidy at the Academy of Natural Sciences, said, no, you're wrong. His head is over here. You've got it put together backwards. And Cope was embarrassed, of course, but he was enough of a scientist to realize that Leidy knew what he was talking about. And he hurriedly rearranged everything, put the head on the tail or on the neck of an animal that is about 40 feet long, but has a 20-foot neck. Really strange. There's nothing like it. But
how much of the vertebrae was Theophilus able to? How much of the skeleton, the backbone, was he able to send?
Well, he got most of it.
Okay,
There
so it
is
wasn't just that little section you showed us.
Well, yeah, he didn't make it from that. He made
Oh,
it from the whole skeleton. When Turner dug it up and sent it back to him by rail, he had 800 pounds of bones and rocks containing bones. So no, that was all he did was send it initially, and Cope was really interested when he saw those few bones. The specimen is fairly complete, at least the vertebrae is. There's a 4-foot section missing here in the middle of the back, but the tail and the neck are essentially complete. Partial skull, no limbs. Those apparently the animal had died and was falling apart before it hit the bottom, and the limbs had been torn off or dropped off first. But in retrospect, this was the first of any specimens of this animal found anywhere in the world. It was the largest fossil specimen known at the time for a long time. And Turner did an excellent job for not knowing anything about paleontology. If you're out in Western Kansas, this is a life-size reconstruction of Elasmosaurus Kansas in the Wallace Museum, Wallace, Kansas. And it's truly, it's very difficult to photograph because it's 40 feet long, and how do you get that all in one photograph? So I've got it really kind of out of perspective here, with the tail being clear over in a doorway and this thing being 40 foot across. So anyway, it's a cool one-of-a-kind specimen for Kansas. In fact, it is the only specimen of Elasmosaurus anywhere. Along the same lines, 1868, about the same time, Captain Cunningham, along the Butterfield Trail at the Castle Rock Station, somehow comes up with a partial skull of a mosasaur. Mosasaurs are a different kind of marine reptile, and he managed to get this up to the railroad and then sell it to the railroad land manager, a guy by the name of William Webb. Webb had connections. He'd been a newspaper man, and so he starts creating this fantasy story about how big this thing is. And there are articles in the Topeka paper and so on about this time. That's this 80-foot long marine reptile. And all it was this part of the skull and a few vertebrae. But he played the game, and he attracted the notice of Louis Agassiz, the paleontologist at Harvard at the time, Museum of Museum of Zoology at Harvard. And Agassiz wanted it enough to pay $500 for it. And this was in 1869. You can imagine what $500 is today in real money or now money. Cope found out about it, borrowed the specimen, and actually started the process of naming it and describing it. And it eventually ends up being Tylosaurus prorigor, which becomes in 2014 one of our 2-state fossils. This is another one found by George Sternberg, or prepared by George Sternberg out at the Sternberg Museum, and it's 29 feet long. As far as the biggest ones in Kansas that we know about are about 45 feet long. So these were truly large animals, skulls up to about 6 feet in length, and very large enough to basically swallow any of us in one gulp. Technical problem.
Oh, it's not going forward now?
No.
Let me see. Oh. Is that what you want? Is it working now? Okay, there we go.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I've talked a little about these guys. Marsh and Cope were the paleontologists of the day. And you hear their names mentioned with the Bone Wars or the Great Fossil Feud or other things like that, because these guys, besides being scientists, were competitors. And they were always trying to outdo each other to the point of, depending on which stories you believe, blowing up the other's fossils or things like that, but mostly trying to discredit the other person. Marsh was the son of a farmer, but he had a rich uncle, and the rich uncle sent him through Harvard for his education in geology, sent him off to Germany, or Europe at the time, to study fossils in the museums there, and then got him a job back at Harvard as the head of the geology department or something like some title like that. Cope, on the other hand, was the son of a rich family. They were shippers out of Philadelphia in the shipping business. And his father wanted him to become a gentleman farmer, but Cope didn't want anything to do with that. He was interested in science. He dropped out of school after high school or after 8th grade, somewhere in there, but immediately went into describing animals. By the time he was 18 or 19 years old, he had described 2 new amphibians from the Northeast that nobody had ever seen or paid attention to before. His father, about that time, that was the Civil War, and of course Cope was draft age. And so his father was not wanting him to be pulled into the war and sent him off to Europe to study. After he came back, he had a job waiting for him. Again, strings were pulled. He had relatives at Haverford College. So he had a position at Haverford College, and he was also working with Leidy at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. So these guys were pretty well set up to do whatever they wanted in paleontology. Paleontology, of course, in the United States was a very new field. It had been going fairly well in Europe for the last 70 or 80 years, but it was still lots to be learned, and lots, particularly about the United States, because nobody had yet explored the interior. Again, they started out as friends, met in Europe. Apparently started a pretty good relationship. But when they came back to the States, Cope told Marsh about his fossil resources, where he was finding fossils in New Jersey in the marl pits. And Marsh apparently went behind his back and started paying the owners of these quarries for the fossils that should, I suppose, rightfully have belonged, or at least had a chance for Cope to work with. So that was not a good start on their problems. But then they found out that fossils were coming out of the West, coming from Kansas, and they both decided they were going to go there and collect there. Marsh got there first in 1870. He led the Yale College scientific expedition all the way across the United States. They went through Nebraska on the recently completed transcontinental railway, collecting fossils in Nebraska and Wyoming and farther west, and eventually ending up in San Francisco. And then in the fall of the year, November, they came back through Denver and then got on the recently completed railway there and went back to Fort Wallace in far western Kansas. Marsh had papers from whoever was important in the military at the time, so he was able to get outfitted with a military wagon train, horses, supplies, and a few soldiers to go off to explore for fossils along the Smoky Hill River east of the thing. But during that trip, it was quite an adventure for these expedition was made up of Marsh and his graduate students and a guide or two. But in the process of being escorted across the United States and camping out, they've got all kinds of adventures. In this case, Marsh is trying to get a horse to carry a giant tortoise shell out of the White River beds in Wyoming, and the horse is not agreeing. There were prairie fires. They did some grave robbing from Plains Indians. That grave robbing back then was acceptable within scientific services, but that wound down fairly quickly, and most of these things, grave goods, were actually required to be returned to the tribes, and that's running into rattlesnakes, taking a bath in a prairie stream and finding out that it was preoccupied. But in Kansas, Marsh did really well. He actually found fragmentary wing bones of the first known pteranodon from Kansas, a big pterosaur. He had seen pterosaurs in Europe, but they're little tiny things from the Jurassic age. And when he saw this, he was able to correctly estimate the size of this particular pteranodon with a wingspread of about 20 feet. It was a huge animal, and he was just really amazed by it. They also found the bones of the first dinosaur to come from Kansas. This is a little hadrosaur, plant eater from Logan County that they found in 1871 and 72, and actually dug up the whole specimen. It's mounted in the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History in New Haven, Connecticut. It's been there for over 100 years. Nobody in Kansas knows about it because they snuck it out of here without really telling anybody, but it is up on the wall. They also found the headless skeleton of a giant, or fairly large, probably a penguin, would have looked a lot like a penguin. Swimming bird. It didn't have wings, but it had strong swimming feet. But it didn't have a head, so he didn't know at the time that it also had teeth, which was pretty amazing at the time. It was about 15 years after the Darwin's Origin of Species was published. And in that, Darwin supposes that there would be transitional species between reptiles and birds. And in this case, reptiles have teeth, birds do not. Well, now we've got a bird with teeth, but it took him another year to actually find that specimen. This is the 1872 expedition. This young man here is Thomas Russell. He's the graduate student that found the first bird with teeth in western Kansas. But I like this picture because these kids, these graduate students, are all armed to the teeth, guns and pistols and knives, and oh my. Marsh is here in the back, and I used to think he was basically the geologist of the group because he's carrying a rock hammer. But if you look closer, that's a pistol holster. So he was armed like everybody else, and now we've got stories of him actually hunting buffalo in Kansas when they came back in November. This expedition was the last one that Marsh led to Kansas. A little later on, he would turn it over to Benjamin Mudge, our first state geologist. And when Mudge died, one of his students, Samuel Williston, would take over working for Marsh, and then eventually come back to Kansas and set up the paleontology program at the University of Kansas, which is still one of the best in the country today. Cope only got here in late 1871, but he had a pretty successful trip too. He had an army escort. That seemed to be the de jure of the time. But the story is, even with all the Army escorts and rifles and everything that they had carrying around in the field, no paleontologist that I'm aware of was ever harmed or seriously threatened by the Indians at that time. Cope managed to find a big fish. Actually, he found most of the fish. That's the skull is what he published. But he called this fish Portheus. It turns out it will become a junior synonym for Zaphactinus that Leidy named, but they didn't know that for years. And because it was so more complete than the original fin that Leidy had named, it actually ends up in more museums under that name than Zaphactinus did. And it took about 30 years before anybody recognized they were the same fish. And then it took longer than that to actually change the names in the collections and so on. So it was quite a mess, but we got through it. We also found a giant turtle called Protostega. And by giant, I mean, this thing is the size of a small car. It can be 10 foot across the flippers and 10 to 12 foot long. Cope was so excited when they found it that they literally, he wrote, they literally attacked it with picks and shovels. And in the process of shipping it, again, 1,500 miles back to Philadelphia, it continued to be broken. And by the time they got it to the academy, it was broken in more than 800 pieces. And you can see this is part of the specimen. This is the plastron, the lower left side of the plastron, and it's badly beat up. The specimen has never really been mounted because it was so badly damaged during collecting. But it was named by Cope and collected it here in western part of the state. Cope also found pterosaur or pteranodon bones. If you go into the writings of the day, these are wing bones, and they're fairly common, and nobody gets too excited about them. But he is claiming that his two species, Ornithocheirus umbrosus and harpy, are bigger or better than Marsh's pterodactyls. And anyway, they go back and forth about who's got the best specimens or the right ideas and so on. And it turns out they're both the same animal. And it really doesn't make any difference. Nobody pays any attention to it. The other thing that they both did, Marsh first, was claim that these animals had teeth in their jaws. And Marsh claimed this before the first skull was actually found. But he claimed it because the European pterosaurs or pterodactyls have teeth in their jaws. And so he assumed that American pterosaurs would also have teeth in their jaws, which they don't. But not to be outdone, Cope agreed with him and said, he said they were obviously predaceous animals because of their teeth and so on. So there was a lot of smoke being blown. Cope had lots of other hands or figures in the pie, if you will, and didn't get back to Kansas, but he did go and hire a young paleontologist, young man at the time, became a paleontologist, by the name of Charles H. Sternberg. Sternberg turned out to be the best investment that Cope ever made, because he had a real knack for finding and recovering fossils. This is a picture of Cope out here on a chalk exposure. Generally, he'd hire a young teenager to take care of the horse and the wagon and setting up camp and things like that. And he would go out in the wilds by himself and this wagon and collect fossils. If you've seen a book called Dragon Teeth, it's a fictionalized account of Cope and his relationship with Sternberg, and also the animosity between Cope and Marsh in that 1870 or 1876 time period. And it's also fiction, so don't bother. No, it's really exaggerated. I suppose it makes good reading, but as far as being truthful or accurate, it lacks. Most of the fossils, or all of the fossils of the time being found in western Kansas were fragments. I mean, animals don't usually die and lay themselves out completely like you see in Jurassic Park or other movies. They're scattered parts and pieces. They've been fed upon by sharks or other animals. And so you really don't have a good picture of what they look like in life. But Cope kind of used his imagination, and all of these shown in this 1872 drawing were animals that Cope had named from fossils from Kansas. So you've got his pterosaurs, Elasmosaurus, Tylosaurus, Protostega turtles, and things like that, based on his imagination more than anything else. The fragmentary specimens that he's been able to work with. As we go forward about 30 years, the fossils are more and more complete. We've got more of them. We've got more things to compare with. So the animals become a bit more real. But in this case, the idea that mosasaurs and plesiosaurs were able to come out on the beaches or on the rocks like alligators is completely false. There are no cliffs in this area for pterosaurs to be hanging from their nails. And so again, it's fabrication, but they were using the best information they had at the time. To go forward to our current view of the ocean, this would be much like the Gulf of Mexico in terms of the animals, the fish and the turtles and other large animals. Of course, we don't have some of these things that are extinct now, or pterosaurs, but we've got seabirds and things like that. But it becomes a little more real with the knowledge of the animals that we've already collected from this area. If we were able to visit the Western Interior Seaway 85 million years ago, go down to the bottom, and it'd be about 600 foot deep. It wasn't very deep, but it would be completely dark down here. You couldn't see. But if you could, it would be a completely flat, featureless plain, mud flat. And every so often you'd have these giant clams. Whoops, back up, Mike. Giant clams, literally 5 foot across, 4 or 5 foot across, and not much else down there. There were a couple of species. At times there were little fish, pteranodons and so on, down here with the clams, but most of the life was going on clear at the surface, 600 foot above you. And it was other than the clams, it was a pretty desolate situation on the sea bottom. Above you, one of the things you certainly run into at some point are large sharks. This is a Gensu shark, Critoxorhina mantelli. It's about 20, the biggest one's 20 to 22 feet long, probably the size of a modern great white. And I call it the Gensu shark because we find all kinds of bones or other fossils in the Western Interior Seaway that have literally been chopped in two by the teeth on this shark. It was a bone biter. You have other sharks, and we'll show you some later, that were basically taking the flesh off the bones, but Critoxorhina literally would bite through bones. Shark teeth are the most common fossils you'll find anywhere in Kansas, particularly in the western part of the state. These are Critoxorhina. Down here, these are the little shark, tiger shark relatives called Squalocorax. These are crusher sharks' teeth. These sharks had jaw plates filled with these teeth, and they were eating hard-shelled prey, whether that was clams or ammonites or other critters that needed to be crunched up first. We don't know for sure, but these were large sharks too. Some of them were over 20 feet long. Kansas is one of the best places in the world for what we call shark mummies. This is a 15-foot Cretoxorhina. It's doubled up here as it was found, but we have it stretched out at the museum. And this is a close-up of the jaws. They're mummies because the cartilage that composes their skeleton is preserved along with their teeth. And so we can get a much better idea of what these things look like in life. But these teeth are just as sharp as when they came out of the living animal or when the animal died. It's an amazing thing to pick up a shark tooth out there and still have a razor tooth edge to it. Besides sharks and mosasaurs, there were other large animals, and like I said earlier, most of them had teeth, and it was literally a fish eat fish world for the most part. One of the things that makes an ocean different from the land, say the animals here on the prairie and so on, most of those animals are plant eaters, converting plant-based food into animal flesh. In the ocean, there's relatively few plant eaters, not relatively few plants to eat. So you have large numbers of small animals or small fish like sardines and herrings and so on, feeding on plankton and so on up to fewer and fewer, but larger and larger predators that are feeding on other smaller fish. So it's a totally different sort of an ecology in the ocean. One of the big ones was, I've already seen, Zopactinus. Large fish up to 18 or 19 feet. I assume they grew larger, but we haven't found them yet. Kind of a glutton. He had a big mouth and a big appetite that got him into trouble more times than not. A lot of the specimens of Zopactinus that we find in Kansas died with the remains of their last meal inside the body, including the fish within a fish. Of course, this is at the Sternberg Museum, collected in 1952 by George Sternberg. It also made Life magazine, if you remember when we still had large Life magazine every week. It was a full page spread, I think, in 1953. And at one point, people have claimed it is the most photographed, or was the most photographed fossil in the world. And that was before cell phones, of course. The lower one here is much bigger. Fish in a fish is 13 foot long. The Gillicus inside, not digested, indicated that the big fish died fairly quickly after he swallowed it. About 6 foot long, would have probably been 40 or 50 pound fish. So it's been quite a meal. This guy is 17 feet long. I found it, oh golly, 1996, I think. And unlike the fish in a fish that was laid out perfectly and just you could dig it up all at once, this guy was spread over an area half the size of this room, and basically we picked it up bone by bone. But that made it possible to mold and cast each bone and then assemble it like a giant model airplane. So this thing stretches out 17 foot in an overhead display at the museum. It's pretty impressive, big fish. I think we loaded the wrong whatever, but anyway. Must have got it mixed up on the thing there. As I mentioned earlier, the Earth was mostly water during the late Cretaceous. And the water was ruled all over the world by giant marine reptiles, whether it's earlier with the Ichthyosaurs and Plesiosaurs, or at the end with the giant mosasaurs, giant turtles. But in my view, it should be the age of marine reptiles, not the age of dinosaurs. But only I don't have a vote, so we'll go with what we got. Turtles, on the other hand, are the only survivors of this group. The mosasaurs, the ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs all died with the dinosaurs or before. Turtles, because they lay hundreds of eggs a year or whatever, have a different reproductive strategy, safety in numbers, and they managed to survive the Cretaceous extinction event. Protostega, our big turtle here in Kansas, weighed probably 2,000, the biggest ones weighed 2,000 pounds, and had to drag, the females had to drag themselves up on the shore at high tide, scoop out a nest, lay their eggs, and then get back to the water and do it fairly quickly because out of the water, they were unable to control their temperature. So if they're out there in midday with the sun beating down on them, they could basically cook inside their shells. So it was quite a process for them to actually get it done within a 12-hour period. Once the eggs were laid, they became prey to just about everything. In this case, dinosaurs on the beach. As the eggs hatched and dug their way out of the sand nest, they had to make it down to the water. Again, they were preyed upon by whatever was out there, dinosaurs and birds and things like that. And then they get into the water and everything there is eating them too. So I like to consider them, oops, I'll go back to that. I like to consider them as popcorn, and I'll show you why in a minute here. The latest discovery we have is about 12 years ago now. This is a fairly large, complete turtle that was found in Gove County, southeast Gove County. And it's interesting, or was interesting to us during the dig, because this is a reconstructed model of it. We've had to add both front limbs and a partial skull up here because whatever killed it had crushed the skull and ripped off the front limbs. But in the process of trying to turn it around in its mouth, there are over 100 puncture bite marks on the shell, top and bottom, where a giant mosasaur, probably 30 foot long, 35 feet long, had finally turned it around and given up and let it fall to the seafloor and be preserved that way. The back half or the back 2/3 of the animal was perfect. We've even got complete tail and both rear limbs. It was a failed attack that killed the turtle, and the mosasaur went away without lunch. I mentioned popcorn. All of the other turtles. There were several, probably a dozen different species of turtles in the seaway, and most of them didn't get very big. And when they hatched, the marine turtles today are about that big around. So anything with a decent sized mouth is capable of eating turtles, and they did. You very seldom see a turtle out there that lived to an old age. Back to our plesiosaurs again. This is Elasmosaurus. Kansas was the locality or the place where the three modern groups of marine reptiles in the late Cretaceous were found here first. Of course, the first was Elasmosaurus. And then we have another group called polycotylids that would have been basically the dolphins or porpoises of the late Cretaceous. And then a giant pliosaur, which is a huge animal that pre-existed them. Elasmosaurs are probably one of the most misunderstood of these marine creatures. Anytime you see a picture of one with its head and neck out of the water like these are old drawings, but this is impossible physically. If you lift it out of the water, gravity's going to take you out of it. And so those are all wrong. And, I'd like to also include the Loch Ness Monster, because Loch Ness Monster has been patterned after the wrong depiction of Elasmosaurs. Polycotylids, like I say, were short, probably 10 to 12 feet long at most. Powerful little swimmers, but with a small heads and large toothy mouth for catching fish. But other than that, they were not terribly dangerous to anything other than a small fish. Plesiosaurs, on the other hand, this is technologically challenged. This is a 6 foot long skull of a plesiosaur. I mean, we're talking that big. Of an animal probably 25, 30 foot long that ate anything and everything that it wanted. The first one, or this skull, was found in 1950 by a couple of young farm kids out there that were looking for shark teeth, and they came across this huge skull laying in the airport chalk. It was collected and put in a frame by H Sternberg here, who thought it was probably something called Brachioceneus, but nobody studied it. And because he put it into plaster like this, so it was a good display, we couldn't see the backside of the skull. And finally, several years ago, we got permission to take it out of his plaster and look at the underside of the skull and determined that it was a new species and for Kansas. And so we redescribed it, renamed it as Megacephalosaurus ulerti, and Ulert is the landowner from where it came originally. So we honored the landowner who donated it to the museum. Plesiosaurs were probably still around when the first mosasaurs evolved into the ocean. Mosasaurs, as near as we can tell, came from lizards, kind of like iguanas, lived on the shore, and then started adapting to living in a regular ocean environment and getting much larger in the process. But the first ones were probably preyed upon by plesiosaurs, and they managed to outlast the plesiosaurs and go on to become basically the rulers of the oceans of that day. Kansas is important because probably more mosasaur specimens come from our rocks than any other place in the world. That may change over time as more places are looked at. There's an awful lot of them that come from Western Canada now, and also from Africa and Morocco and so on. But for the present, most of them come from here in Kansas. This is the skull of our Tylosaurus at the Sternberg Museum. Is 4 feet long. The teeth are in just beautiful shape. We don't know what killed it, but it died and was pretty well preserved intact on the seafloor. But during the erosion that exposed it, a gully cut right through the middle of the animal and kind of ruined some of the vertebrae there. But otherwise, it's really a nice specimen. And it's an example of, again, our state fossil that was signed into law in 2014.
Is the state fossil that specimen or the
No.
species?
No, it's there's no designated specimen. There's just a designated species. We have no evidence at this point that mosasaurs were cannibalistic toward each other, but we do know from bite marks on several specimens that they didn't get along very well. A lot of them have a lot of peeled bite marks, and in the case of this animal, this Mosasaurus from South Dakota, it's apparent that a larger mosasaur crushed his skull and sent him to the bottom, but didn't feed on him. And so it's more of a territorial or a mating dispute or something along those lines. They just did not get along with one another. This is including my type specimen of Tylosaurus Kansas that has huge bite marks on the skull here. And if you measure the distance between the bite marks, you get an idea of how big the jaws of the animal was that killed him. In fact, one of the skull is crushed, but also the neck is comes off here at about a 45-degree angle, which probably means the neck was broken. By comparison of the teeth or the spacing on the teeth, it appears that this animal was about 15 or 16 feet long in life. The large spacing on the other one suggests that the one that killed it was 20 to 22 feet long and probably weighed about twice as much. So it was no contest. Again, this guy was killed and sent right to the bottom. Mosasaurs, Ichthyosaurs, and Plesiosaurs are kind of unique in that they gave live birth to their young. This apparently is a very important adaptation to life in the sea, because dragging yourself up on land to lay eggs in these groups is not a good idea. They gave live birth in mid-ocean. They gave live birth to fairly large babies, which have a much better survival rate than tiny turtles did. But turtles laying hundreds of eggs at a time, you get an advantage there in numbers. But during the late part of the Cretaceous, these guys were very successful and basically took over the oceans of the planet for a space of about 35 million years.
Where did that tongue come from?
What?
That tongue is very reptilian. Do you think that?
They're snakes. They're related to snakes and monitor lizards. Yeah.
So
Yeah. They do have a tongue. There's been some argument about that, but monitor lizards have tongues and snakes have got tongues. They also have adaptations in the skull, like a snake, to be able to ratchet pull their prey back into the throat like that, and literally have a joint in the mid jaw that bends like that.
Hey, Mike, is that a head on each end?
Is that what?
a head on
Is
each
that a head
end.
Each end, is that?
It's a flat tail.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the tail I think they belong with. Now, some of the modern reconstructions will put a tail fluke on there based on a specimen that came out of Lebanon. But I'm suspicious because I've never, thousands of specimens that we have don't have a tail fluke. And I don't like to see, I don't want to see it changed on the basis of one.
Is that actually two heads? Or a head and a end?
No, it's not a head. I'm sorry. I've got ear problems. No, that's just a flat, broad oar-like tail and swims like this.
Oh, but it's giving birth in this picture.
Yeah, it's giving birth. That's a young one. They coming out tail first, which is also an adaptation that occurred in mammals as land mammals evolved into whales and porpoises. They had to change the birth mechanism to the point that the animal comes out the head comes out last, and then the animal's immediately able to swim to the surface and get a breath of air. But that's different, I guess, and between land mammals and sea mammals, the process gets reversed. Our other state fossil is Pteranodon longiceps, found first and most here in Kansas, starting in 1870, but we've got literally over 2,000 specimens, I think, right now from the state. So it's not uncommon, but it only exists pretty much in the Midwest for about a period of 8 million years. There are lots of other Pteranodon specimens around the world, dozens of them, species, but this is the only one that was in Kansas at that particular time. Size-wise, modern Andean condor, wingspread of about 10 feet compared to an adult male Pteranodon with a wingspread of 22 to 24 feet.
Yeah.
So these were fairly large creatures, but they aren't the largest ones. We've got Quetzalcoatlus from Texas and some other much larger airplane-sized, or airplane winged, I guess, pterosaurs from around the world. We have a second species called Pteranodon Sternbergi, based solely on this one skull. Normally the crest comes off to the back. This one tends to go up. And this is the only real difference in the skeleton is this crest, and that is only on the very mature males. So we're not sure quite what's happening there. I tend to favor the idea this is a pathologic specimen, that he had some sort of something wrong with that crest. We also have a much smaller pterosaur called Nicktosaurus that only has a wingspread of at max 6 to 8 feet. Only, yeah. There, as we can tell, they were all fish eaters. We're not sure exactly how they fished, whether they were divers or sat on the surface, or they fed along the shores, or what. Most of the evidence that we'd like to have of shorelines and rookeries and other things has been eroded over the years, and we'll probably never really get a good picture of that. Fun fact, Kansas pteranodon is the most famous pterosaur in the world. Everybody recognizes it. We've had good press all the way back to The Lost World, King Kong, Fantasia, lots of B-rated movies that used pterosaurs, and even Jurassic Park. And this one, I think they even put teeth in the dang thing. So, but it's still Pteranodon longiceps. So around the world, everybody knows about Kansas pterosaurs. Toothed birds. We talked earlier about Marsh finding Hesperornis regalis in Kansas, 1871-72. It probably was not able to move very well on land. This is Marsh's early drawing of it, but it's unlikely that it was able to actually stand upright like that. More likely it sprawled out on the shore and moved by pushing itself along the shoreline. But in the water, it would have been very fast and a very efficient predator on small fish. It does have very toothy jaws. We don't know whether or not it actually had a horny keratin beak or not, but more than likely it did. So it's again, first from Kansas, and the best ones, the most complete specimens come from Kansas. Our other toothed bird was found by Benjamin Mudge up in Rooks County, and also in the summer of 1872. So it's actually the first bird with teeth from the state, but it took a long time to actually recognize that, because Marsh, when he first looked at it, thought it was a commingled bunch of bones, and that these toothy jaws actually came from a lizard that he named Colonosaurus. But after looking at it a little closer, he changed his mind, and Colonosaurus disappeared from the scientific literature. But he never admitted making a mistake either. Dinosaurs, we're getting to the end here. Dinosaurs don't swim across the ocean, but we do find dinosaur bones in the Smoky Hill chalk. And it has to be from animals that died someplace else and floated out to sea, or were washed out to sea, carried out in a storm or something like that, floated around for a while, and then eventually fell apart or sank to the bottom and were buried along with the other sea life. Again, the first one that we have is Tylosaurus from Russell County. It's a very complete specimen except from the skull. The skull was missing when it was found. We have another hadrosaur that a friend of mine found, or well, I guess we both found it because he thought it was a fish. But this is a tail section, 9 vertebrae, that a shark literally swam up the tail, shook his head and bit it off, partially digested the flesh off the bones, and then regurgitated the bones, fell to the seafloor and were found just like that. So there's only 2 hadrosaurs that we know about from Kansas. The rest of them, probably 10 specimens by now, are ankylosaurs, called Nibrasaurus the type specimen here from Kansas. This one was found by an oilfield geologist out in Gove County in 1932, I believe. He collected it up, actually poured plaster on the bones and dug it up and sent it off to his alma mater, which was the University of Missouri at Columbia. And there it was taken out and described and named Herrerasaurus coli. It was re-examined and redescribed in 1996, I believe, and given the name Niobrarasaurus because it's different from the original, the type specimen Herrerasaurus. So it's unique, and this is the type specimen, which is kind of a fun story for me because when we were working with another specimen, actually just two bones from the forelimb of a juvenile Ankylosaur or Notosaur, I inquired at the University of Missouri, Columbia, if we could actually compare the bones. And in the process of those conversations, I was bold enough to ask if it was possible we could bring the specimen back to Wichita. My boss at the Sternberg was amazed. Said, "You don't do that." Why not? I didn't know that anyway, so I did, and they said yes. The professor there was actually concerned that some state representative there in Missouri was going to find out about it, and they'd want to put it down on display in Branson or something. So we got it back here in 2002. I took a field trip that same year out to the same square mile. We didn't know where the original specimen came from, but I took a field trip out that area, and at the end of the day, my friend Tom called me up on the phone on the radio and says, "Mike, I've got some bones here I don't recognize." And so I walked over and looked at him and said, I congratulated him on being the 12th or whatever person to find a dinosaur in Kansas.
Mhm.
And then as I looked closely, and it doesn't show up good on this picture, these bones still have plaster on them.
Oh,
When Virgil Cole, who found the original specimen, was recovering it, he covered everything in plaster and then he had to dig everything up. Well, at some point in the dig, he covered the right front foot of the animal with dirt or rock and lost it on the dig site. And so 70 years later, we're lucky enough to find the right front foot laying where it weathered out. In fact, it was right at the edge of a gully, and the next rain would have probably washed it away. But those bones are these bones right there in the display at the Sternberg.
cool.
Anyway, fossils have been collected from Western Kansas for more than 150 years now, but there's still a lot to be discovered out there. We're still naming new species of all kinds of things. We just received a review a couple of weeks ago of a new Elasmosaur from up around Holyrood that was collected by the Sternbergs in 1932 and sent to the University of Nebraska, where I saw it several years ago. And we started looking at it, and turns out it is different enough to be a completely new species. So that'll be published later this year. But
Congratulations.
yeah, if you're interested, this is a library. If you're interested in learning more about the history of these fossils here in Kansas, these are books that cover a variety of times and subjects, but basically Cope and Marsh and the Bone Hunters and the Gilded Dinosaurs and whatever, and Oceans of Kansas. I was fortunate enough, I didn't start out to be an author, published the first book in 2005, and then I had an opportunity 12 years later to do it again, which was really great because technology has changed. The new book is in full color, and don't drop it on your foot because it weighs about 3 pounds. But anyway, appreciate the time, and thank you all for coming out.
Do you have events that people like us could go to where you're out collecting?
I have.
Have you ever had that?
I'm also 76 years old. And I don't do it that much anymore. My wife and I were a team hunting in the chalk. And she's just recently had 2 knee replacements. So that makes you pretty unstable walking around the rocks. I'd like to do it again. The Sternberg Museum does field schools for kids more than anything else, but I'd like to get a program started where we can have the public out. We did it in 1996 on a mosasaur dig in Gove County and had a great time. People will come out, sit in the sun, get burned, get dirty, tired, thirsty, whatever, and just love it. They'll come back the next day and want to do it again.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much true for just about any paleontology dig that you go on. It's excitement. It's, to me, digging up a fossil, you're the first one to see it in 85 million years. And that's excitement to me. So keeps me going. So anybody else?
We did have a question on the people watching on Facebook. I guess actually from my mom. Was there an event that suddenly killed all the sea life, or did the ocean disappear gradually?
Well, there's 2 questions there. The ocean over Kansas did disappear gradually or retreat gradually to the Gulf of Mexico and to the Arctic Circle. But that was as the land, the Western United States, was being uplifted. There was not an extinction associated with that. That probably occurred 1 million years or so before the dinosaurs died. But it looks like from the fossil record and core samples and other things that we can see that the oceans at this particular time were dying. And we're not sure why, but if you look at the phytoplankton, the little critters that everything above feeds upon and survives upon, the phytoplankton in the world's oceans took a big dive at some point. Well, in that case, it wasn't a big meteor falling out of the sky that killed the plesiosaurs and the mosasaurs. They starved to death. The food chain collapsed. They had nothing to eat, and over several thousand years probably, their population has dwindled and went away. And so that's the best answer we have right now. Yes, sir.
What is there about the mosasaur that scientists concluded they gave live birth to their young?
We've got a specimen from up in South Dakota, plioplated carpus, that when they dug it up, they found the remains of 5 baby mosasaurs inside. There is a specimen from Kansas of a polycotyledonous plesiosaur that is associated with one baby skeleton. So we don't have any other explanation for it. They were not capable, by the time they had adapted fully to life in the sea, in a lot of cases in mosasaurs, their bones were fairly flexible, cartilaginous. They didn't have the strength or the reach in their limbs to actually get up on the land like an alligator or a crocodile. And so if they were washed ashore in a storm or a tide or something like that and were beached, they couldn't usually get back into the water. So those trains of evidence, lead us to be pretty positive that they gave live birth at sea. Would like to find more evidence of it. Mosasaurs are apparently pretty good eating. They tasted like chicken or something, but when a mosasaur died, most likely the sharks would carve it up pretty rapidly. So finding a complete one is pretty rare. And we don't have a lot of evidence other than that one specimen. So it's cool. Yeah.
The Elasmosaurus, do paleontologists have an idea why it was adapted to have such a long neck?
We're guessing.
Mm-hmm.
The best idea we have right now is that when it was swimming underwater, that long neck allowed it to reach up toward the surface to a school of fish and be completely hidden in the darkness below. So it was a kind of a stealth hunting technique. And, it had most of the plesiosaurs had teeth that were interlocking like fish traps. So it would grab and swallow and grab and swallow. They were not capable of tearing up their prey. They swallowed their fish whole, but they also had gastroliths, stomach stones, in their gizzards and or whatever structure that was. And that ground that was used to grind up the fish. We've got a neat specimen from out near Sharon Springs that is a pile of quartzite pebbles, if you will, but mixed in with the pebbles are ground up bones of a fish we can identify as Encotus, the saber-toothed herring. And so that's kind of cool to be able to figure out what he was eating just before he died. But yes, sir.
Do you still have quite a bit of trouble with the people out there that go on people's land and stuff, searching for these things to just for the market, selling, that type of thing?
I know of several instances that we've had people poaching. In fact, the mosasaur that I dug up in 1996 and had the crowd, actually mostly family, but a bunch of people out around it, was being poached from somebody on a 4-H field trip that had found it, but then, marked it and went back and then came back and dug it up on private property. And the guy was actually incensed when the landowner told him to leave because it was his fossil. Well, no, it's not.
Yeah.
The law in Kansas says fossils are owned by the landowner. And if you don't have permission to be on that land, you shouldn't be there. So it's not a big problem. We haven't got anything from Kansas that's going for millions of dollars like you see the dinosaurs doing. So up in Montana, South Dakota, those areas up there, it can be a high dollar crime, if you will. Dinosaur or the T-Rex Sioux went for $6 million. That was a long time ago. The newer ones are going for higher than that. A lot of people have got a lot of money and that tempts them, but not such a bad problem in Kansas. And I keep watch on some of the fossils. I do know of places where people have stolen things, and unfortunately that's humans, but we're pretty good on it. And one of the things is that people are currently more interested in dinosaurs. They have a higher market value for whatever reason. I'm not interested in them at all, but I know that there's some folks that are. I've got, Western Kansas has been neat for me because of the marine life that is represented here. Not available in many other places in the world. All right. Well, yes, sir.
Have you ever checked it in Ellsworth, the town of Ellsworth, the guy that has the ready mixed concrete, he found a thigh bone in the sand, just one thigh bone, and not the rest of it. And it's probably 4 feet long. And he had set him beside the door of his office. I just come in and I'm afraid somebody's gonna walk off with it. He said, if you can carry it, you can have it. But why would there be just one bone in a sand pit?
Because the sand that he's quarrying there in the sand pit is a river bed. And so in that case, it's a mammoth, probably a mammoth. I've got a mammoth tooth from a sand pit south of Wichita. But it was washed into the river and then scattered, the bones were scattered as a carcass disintegrated. So you're not likely in a sand pit zone to find a complete animal of anything. They generally are river worn and washed. Years ago, golly, it's been 15 years ago, there was one elephant tusk that came out on Kellogg Highway 54 going on in East Wichita, and they stopped the construction of the road to get people out there to dig it up. It's an exploration place now, but it's again a river deposit that this whole part of the country was completely different millions of years ago. Lots more water, forested sometimes. Of course, after the ocean disappeared, we went through a whole series of changes to be where we're at today, to be the open prairie. But We've had all kinds of rivers and streams through here that carried anything that was in the area at the time. I've got a, just recorded on a bear skull from, it'd be 15 miles south of here in Park City. A bear jaw that we found 4 years ago in the old golf course up there that had been washed in this old stream. It was a sandy bottom stream in there, but it was a bear jaw was laying out there, and that bear would have been about 9 foot tall. Huge animal, but nobody expected to find it there either. It was quite a surprise for us. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.